All right, this morning we have something that comes out of Matthew chapter 5. This is what we often call the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is really possibly not even a sermon at all, but rather just times that he was talking to the people on the mountain and gave them these things to remember. But there's an awful lot in this particular thing. In fact, Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 6, and Matthew chapter 7 all are part of the quote-unquote Sermon on the Mount. You want to memorize that? Go ahead and do so. It won't hurt. But we know a lot of these passages already, don't we? We've heard them preached. We've read them before. You have heard it said, the subject of this particular lesson are the 6 times he says, "But I say unto you." And so we're going to go into that this morning. "But I say unto you," out of Matthew chapter 5. In this, I want you to think, though, for a moment. Why does he say, "I say unto you"? Is that because he's bringing a new law? You know, we can argue this until we're blue in the face. I've got a good brother in California. He's 95 years old now, preacher of the gospel, and he says absolutely this was a brand new law he was bringing. I'm sorry, but he's wrong. He's mistaken. 95 years old or not. The fact is, Jesus was telling them something they already knew. But he was then taking it and clarifying it for something a little bit better than what they thought. You got to remember, they had traditions as well as the law itself. In fact, one of the problems with the Pharisees was that they were willing to accept their traditions as laws of men, as laws of God, when they were really just the traditions of men. So they would take this law of Moses and give it an identity that they would then explain a little bit. And so Jesus is saying, no, I want you to listen to what God really intended. And I honestly believe that this is not a new law. This is merely what God meant in the first. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through, you've heard it said, "But I say unto you." There are 6 different things that he goes through there. He says, you've heard it said, for example, "Do not murder." Sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Sounds pretty reasonable too, doesn't it? We're going to go into that one. "Do not commit adultery." That seems reasonable as well. Perhaps not as much as the murder part, but that's okay. We'll live with it, right? "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." Well, that makes pretty good sense too on the surface. Make sure that she's free to go on and live her life, right? How about "Do not swear falsely"? Well, that one we kind of fudge a little bit sometimes, don't we? They did too. That's the reason he talked about it. "An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Boy, we don't have a clue as to what this one means, but we think we do. Jesus is going to clarify that. And he says you should love your neighbor and hate your enemy. That's what they had said. That's what they've heard it said. Most of these are fairly common ideas that we can get out of almost any religious group or any religious talk. And in doing so, we probably have the mind of man more so than the mind of God, don't we? But they're reasonable things for us to consider. But he doesn't stop there. He says, you've heard it said, "But I say unto you." Everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. I'm just going to take the first line of his answer in each one of these as we go through this list. How about everyone looking at a woman? Now, why does he say a woman? Men are the only ones that commit adultery by looking at women. Women commit adultery too by looking, I understand, but I didn't find that out until I was an old man. But the fact is, it can happen either side. Everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. We're going to go back to that one. Everyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality. Now that's a little more difficult, isn't it? It says don't just give her a writing of divorcement because she no longer pleases you, but rather there has to be a reason for it. But then he doesn't stop there. He says makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries her commits adultery as well. Very difficult, isn't it? "But I say unto you," he says, "do not take an oath at all. Do not resist the one who is evil. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Well, isn't that difficult? Nobody said it was going to be easy, did they? All right, let's go back to that. Do not take an oath at all. All right, I don't want to take an oath. Matthew 5, verse 21. You've heard it said, "Of those of old." Who's he talking about? He's talking about their forefathers, isn't he? He's talking about the ones who received the law in the first place. The law of Moses that was given, it says, do not, whatever that do not was, do not murder. King James Version in the Old Testament Law of Moses, when it gives the 10 Commandments, says, "Thou shalt not kill." The actual Hebrew word there does not say kill, it says murder. There's a difference in the translation there, isn't there? Big difference. And by the way, we have definitions of murder, don't we? The law of Moses had definitions of murder as well. An individual who defended himself was not considered a murderer. However, he might have to run for his life anyway, So they set up cities of refuge. They set up places where he was safe. He could go into the temple and grab the hold of the horns of the altar, for example, and he would be safe. He could go into these cities of refuge, and the city was mandated by God to protect him from those who would want to seek vengeance for the loss of their loved one. But you shall not murder is what it actually says. You've heard it said, whoever murders will be liable to judgment. You go before the court of the law, they say you committed murder, so you're going to have to do what? You're going to have to die, aren't you? That was one of the capital punishment crimes, wasn't it? But I say unto you, and he's going to go back now and show that thou shalt not murder issue in the Old Testament. Genesis chapter 9. Now this is not in the law of Moses very quickly, is it? For your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from men. From his fellow men I will require a reckoning for the life of man. God established in the beginning that death would not be something tolerable. Murder would not be something acceptable. Genesis 9 verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. Do you believe in capital punishment? You should. God does. He decreed it from the very beginning. And that's exactly what this means. By man will his blood be shed. That doesn't mean a little bit of blood letting, just a little prick to get a little blood flowing. That means taking his life, killing him because he killed somebody else. God made man in his own image. That's the reason why. Do you have the right to kill someone? It's a simple answer on that one, or a simple question. No, you do not have the right to kill someone. By the way, do you have the right to take your own life? Why not? Because God made man in his own image. We sometimes forget these things. It's good to go back and review them. But I say unto you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Not just commits murder, but is angry with his brother is liable to judgment. Anyone who insults his brother can go before the council. And whoever says, you fool, that's what the word reka means in the King James translation that we read earlier. Whoever says, you fool, is liable to hell fire. Now, by the way, have you ever called anybody a fool? I'm not talking about your wife or your husband. I'm talking about somebody else. You know, we have a problem with this sometimes, don't we? We get angry. And that's foolish, or you are being a fool by saying that. But he says this is an intent of what's the title for it under the law? Assault? Yeah, assault and battery, okay? The idea is we can actually be harmful in what we're saying there. It's not just simply having harmful words, it's actually having harmful intent. Harmful thoughts in our heart. He says, but I say unto you. Now this is a big difference than just simply thou shalt not kill, isn't it? Jesus is not bringing a new law, but he's telling what God intended all along. You're made in the image of God, you don't have the right to kill another person. But we should be treating each other different also because we're made in the image of God. We should not insult, we should not be angry, we should not call them fools. But I say unto you, Matthew 5 verse 23. So if you're offering your gift at the altar, and you remember that someone has something against you, notice he didn't say if someone has something against you while you're taking somebody at the altar, they come to you. He says you stop what you're doing and go to them to make it right. Well, they never came to me. They don't have to, do they? You need to go to them. Leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. This interferes with our offering of our gifts to God. Boy, that's difficult, isn't it? Jesus, you could have just kept quiet about that, couldn't you? You didn't have to say that. No, he had to say that. But I say unto you, it's not the same as thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder. It is a lot more than that, isn't it? It interferes with our relationship with God. Matthew 5, verse 25. Come to terms quickly with the one that has something against you while you're on the way, lest you get to the judge, and the judge goes to the guard and hands you to him, and the guard puts you in prison. And you will pay every penny that you owe. Make arrangements with them before it ever gets that far. Now that just sounds like common sense, doesn't it? Reasonable, logical, common sense. But remember what's wrong with common sense? It's not very common. Here Jesus is putting it out there very plainly for them, helping them to go back. By the way, when was the law of Moses given at the time Jesus is saying this? How long ago had it been? $1,400 or 1,500 years. By our best estimates, by our best understanding of the Scripture, it was about 1,400 years. That's how long they had been keeping this long. That's an awful long time. How old is America? 200 something? Now, we haven't been keeping our laws nearly as long as they've been keeping theirs, have we? You think it's possible they had forgotten what really the intent was of the law that had been given in the first place? Do you think they had played games with it? Rearranging it? Oh, by the way, there were lawyers in their time, weren't there? They redefined some of those rules, didn't they? Jesus is clarifying what they're supposed to be doing and what God intended in the first place. Matthew 5, verse 27, you've heard that it was said. He starts off with that in every one of these categories. You shall not commit adultery. Seems reasonable, right? But what does adultery actually mean? Well, we're going to go through that in a little bit. But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman, and we look at women, don't we, guys? Come on, just admit it, it's okay. But if you look at a woman with lustful intent, now that's a little different, isn't it? We're not just talking about admiring the beauty that God created. We're talking about something more than that. Has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Lustful intent means I want to do something with her. Lustful intent means I want to take her clothes off and go do something. We're adults in here, aren't we? Most of us? Okay. Then let's understand that for what it means. Lustful intent. Lust in the heart, I believe is what it's spoken of. Now, men, we're Christians now. Before we became Christians, see, I'm going to be very generous here. Did you look with lustful intent on a woman occasionally before you became a Christian? Yeah, probably. After you became a Christian, that all ended, didn't it? Well, okay. But if you do so, you're committing adultery. Now that's pretty strong. You don't have to actually go do something for it to be considered adultery. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Don't even look with lustful intent. Instead, do what? 2 Peter chapter 2 actually talks about somebody coming in and being divisive in the church. He talks about him having eyes full of adultery. I think one of the reasons he uses that phrase is because it expresses something that's understood. They're doing something that is not intended to be good for the church or for you, but rather are doing something that is intended for their own benefit, for whatever reason it may be. And by the way, what is more selfish than for a man to go after a woman with the intent of having sex with her outside of marriage? What in the world would cause him to think he has that right? By the way, what is considered one of the worst crimes in our society today, even in our society today, which has kind of reduced the criminal aspects of some of our sins to where they're no longer a problem. I mean, he just brags about it. You go through the checkout line at the store, and so-and-so's shacking up together, having a baby. They're not even married yet, and they probably didn't have a right to get married in the first place. But nevertheless, they're doing these things and proudly announcing it. But there's one thing we consider still bad, and what is that? Rape. What else? Child abuse. Child sex. Child rape. And that's really what it is. Well, they gave me permission. A child by law cannot give permission. They're not old enough to be able to do that. You can't get permission from a child when they're not old enough to do so. How selfish, how self-interested, how, well, sinful does a person have to be to think that it's okay to go do that? They have eyes full of adultery, he talks about these people, insatiable for sin. That kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? There's a lot of people in our society today that are insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls. That means they entice us. They have hearts trained in greed, and I like that. This particular translation says they're trained in greed. And isn't that what we see in a lot of our world today? People that think it's okay to steal as long as it's done in a certain fashion. It's just business, right? Don't we hear that all the time? No, it's not acceptable even then. He calls them accursed children. In Matthew 5, verse 21, if your right eye causes you to sin, okay, my right eye, pardon me. If your right eye, what does that mean? I saw a woman and I lusted after her. Well, then I should do what with that eye? Pluck it out. How many of you still have both eyes? Yeah. Is this literally intending for us to pluck the eye out? I personally don't think so. But his point is very strongly made, nevertheless. He says it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be completely thrown into hell. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? If it's just my right eye, my left eye is not causing the offense, my right eye is, then I should do something to keep it from becoming a problem, right? The problem is it's not the eye that's the problem, is it? It's in here. And I don't mean by that literally the heart. I mean that by which we think and are and exist, by the character of our heart. Martin Luther King said that once, and it was so true. That's the intent we should be looking for, not the other. Your whole body thrown into hell. The word hell here is a very strong statement concerning condemnation, and it is one we understand. Jesus refers to the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. Revelation refers to the lake that burns with fire as well, refers to hell. But we understand the concept. Verse 30, if your right hand causes you to sin, then cut it off. Why would we cut off our hands? We wouldn't, would we? But if it would keep us from going to hell, wouldn't it be worth it? It would, wouldn't it? But it's not the hand that's the problem. It's the heart that's the problem, isn't it? But he wants you to put it into perspective. It's better to lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell. Now, we've argued this in the past, and sometimes you'll hear somebody says, well, that's not what they should be cutting off. Yeah, that's probably true as well. But that's not what the issue is it? The issue is the attitude of the heart and mind. It's a perverted soul. It is a twisted soul that needs to be corrected. And it is not the member of the body that's really the issue. But that's how serious Jesus places this. He says it's also been said that whoever divorces his wife, it's interesting, it comes right after the discussion on lusting and committing adultery, doesn't it? Give her a certificate of a divorce. By the way, this again is the old law of Moses. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 sets the standard of marriage. This is at the very beginning when God made Eve out of the rib of Adam. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become what? Not just one what? One flesh. Now this is mysterious. It's not something we can actually explain fully. I've heard some of my brethren argue this point sometimes, and I think they've missed the point of it. The merging of two into one is what he's referring to here. Two that were made for each other. By the way, how many of you in here married a Steve instead of an Eve? I don't mean you women, I mean you men. A man and a woman. A man will leave his family and join himself to his woman. And they will become one flesh. That's the standard. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if he finds that she has no favor in his eyes, he must give her then a certificate of divorce. Put it in her hand and send her out of the house. And if she departs out of the house, then the divorce is complete. And that's fairly simple. Why don't we do that today? Oh, we do, don't we? Except we don't do the certificate of divorce. We just say, okay, I'm done. And we go. I'm talking about Hollywood again, but it's not Hollywood, is it? It's right out these doors in this neighborhood next to us. It's all around us. And even, may I say, among some of us here. We've got to be careful of this. Let's go back. All right, but I say to you what? Don't just give a certificate of divorce, but I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife, and by the way, I believe this is a counter as well, any wife who divorces her husband, except on the ground of sexual immorality. King James says on the grounds of what? Fornication or adultery, depending on the translation in which verse you're at. But the idea is sexual immorality. That's what fornication means. And he makes her then to commit adultery, and whoever marries her commits adultery also. We're going to stop here for a moment. Not for 30 minutes, but for a couple of minutes. What's one of the things we have happening in our society right now that's been going on for decades and decades and decades? And it's become such that we even have statistics saying that half of all marriages fail, which, by the way, is not true. What they do is they take all of the marriage certificates, all the marriage licenses that are offered, that are bought, that are established, and then they take all the divorces that year, and just so happened all the people that got married this year, there were 50% equal that got divorced. You mean to tell me that all those got divorced that quickly? Of course not. And then you had someone like Elizabeth Taylor who had how many husbands? That's a curve breaker in the statistics world, isn't it? Huge. What in the world was she thinking? I don't know, but I'm sure it cost her a lot of money. The problem is we've got a society that accepts that as the norm. It's okay. California has something called no-fault divorce. What does that mean? I'm not really sure what it means, but basically they don't go after each other to determine which one's in the right and which one's in the wrong. They just go ahead and say it's okay. Is that what Jesus says? If we take this literally in its statement as it is, he says the only reason for divorce is sexual immorality. Something was done wrong sexually. Well, what could that be? Generally, we think of adultery. Sex outside of marriage. She didn't go to her husband, she went to somebody else. One of those predators got to her and she made a mistake. By the way, that's not the reason for divorce. But it is sexual immorality, so we can argue it, can't we? But notice what he says here. He says, except for sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. Why? You divorced her for the wrong reason. You didn't divorce for sexual immorality, you just decided you didn't like the way she fixed your breakfast. By the way, that used to be argued. During the time of Christ, it was honestly thought that all you had to do, if she displeased me, I had the right to get rid of her. Makes sense to me. How about you guys? You guys okay with that? Not you women, you guys, okay, yeah. But he says no, except for fornication. If she is given a writing of divorcement for anything other than sexual immorality, she is not officially free to go out and marry again, is she? So you in effect make her commit adultery by putting her out of the house. Is that okay? But then he goes on, whoever marries a divorced woman in that circumstance commits adultery also. You got to have the right to remarry, don't you? It's not enough to just say, I don't want you anymore. I say unto you. And again, you've heard it said, you shall not swear falsely. I like this one. You know, false swearing, what does that mean? It means going to court and swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God, and then lying on the stand, right? Our world is so turned upside down, our Congress is so turned upside down, people get in trouble for lying in court rather than for doing something wrong. What? Yeah, we need to tell the truth. We need to not falsely swear. But the thing that was wrong in the first place. Not just because you tried to cover it up, not just because you lied about it when they were trying to find out the truth of the matter. You know, you'll see the crimes listed sometimes. Making false statements to a police officer, making false statements to the judge. So what? Why is that any worse than making a false statement to each other? He's going to talk about this just a little bit further, though. You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. Now, we don't do this in our churches. We don't do this in our culture really that much. But there was an oath-taking that was done as part of their religious service. They would take a vow. They would take an oath. We take vows like marriage, and we take them very seriously enough to wait till the next day to divorce them, right? But if you make a vow, you make an oath, you need to perform it as if you're doing it before the Lord. But Jesus says, well, let's go back just a little bit and look at this in terms of the law that they were taught. Leviticus 19, you shall not swear by my name falsely. Isn't that right? Even in the Ten Commandments, the one commandment was, do not bear false witness. But he says, you profane the name of God when you do this. He says, I am the Lord. That should be a period at the end of that. Is there a period at the end of that? Yeah, the period actually is our grammar, but still, that says it all, doesn't it? I am the Lord. Do not falsely swear. If you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay fulfilling it, for the Lord your God will surely require it of you, or you will be guilty of sin. You promise God something and then you don't do it, you're guilty of sin. That's what he's talking about here. He's not talking about swearing. He's not talking about what my mom told me once. You're not supposed to use a cuss word. Mom, that's not what it says. I didn't tell her that. I've still got my jaw. But you understand what I mean. We use the word swearing a little bit too generally in reference to some of the stuff we do. No, this is referring to us making a promise, vowing something, making an oath. Jesus says, but I say unto you, do not take an oath at all. By the way, when was Jesus telling this to them? He was talking to a Jewish audience under the law of Moses, right? Why did he tell them not to take an oath at all? Weren't they allowed, weren't they required to take vows and oaths under their religious law? Yeah, but he's not talking about that, is he? They would take other kinds of oaths. Remember where he talks about them making a swearing by the temple? Well, they didn't have to be held to it if it was just by the temple. But if it was by the gold of the temple, then they had to fulfill it. Yeah, well, God gave them an obligation to take care of their parents in their old age, and they were swearing off that, saying, no, we've already given this to God, to the temple, so we can't give it to you. Crazy stuff, huh? Jesus says, but I say unto you, do not take an oath at all. Well, we should probably just go right there, don't we? Either by heaven, because it's the throne of God, by the earth, because that's his footstool. How about by Jerusalem? Well, that's the holy city, isn't it? No, it's the city of the great king. We're not supposed to use it frivolously that way either. Do not take an oath by your head. My goodness, why would we think we would have some power in an oath anyway? You can't even change the color of your hair. All right, ladies, I know you can cheat. That's not what I'm talking about. And, of course, all you have to do to turn from black to white-haired is to have children, right? Anyway, that's not what he's talking about. He says, instead, just simply say yes and no. Don't say, by God, yes. Don't we do that? As a culture, as a people, and sometimes even ourselves. This is something that applies to us today just as much as it did them. But he said, simply say yes or no. Is the word of a Christian supposed to be valid? Is it supposed to be something that can be depended upon? That it is sound? It's as if God said it himself when I say it, because I'm going to be righteous and fulfill my obligation. Of course, then let your yes and no be simply yes and no. Anything more than that comes from the evil one or comes from evil, depending on your translation there. Anything other than that is evil. That should be enough for us, shouldn't it? Don't do it. All right, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Really? Yeah. Actually, out of Leviticus 24, verse 19, if anyone injures his neighbor. By the way, this is not the only place in the law of Moses that mentions this. It's actually repeated several times throughout the law of Moses. As he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. Now that would have been an interesting court, wouldn't it? Guy comes in with broken fingers and somebody says, well, he broke my fingers. Okay, let's go ahead and do it. Now, it's kind of a strange court by our standards, but that would have been understandable, wouldn't it? We hurt somebody we shouldn't have done. But I say unto you this, do not resist the one who is evil. Now, I don't know why he says who is evil here, but I get the idea that he's actually saying the evil one, tempting you to take vengeance for yourself. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, do what? Turn the other cheek. That's not humanly reasonable, is it? That's not what happens. I'm going to get you back, aren't I? That's the way we think. He says, no, turn the other cheek. It's not necessary. Matthew 5, verse 40, if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, give him your coat also. Why would I put up with that? Why would I allow someone to take advantage of me that way? Because it doesn't matter, does it? We think this world matters so much. We think the things of this world matter so much. I was young, about 5 or 6 years old, and my sister and I went to the store with a couple of pennies each to go buy some candy. Shows you how long it's been since I was a little boy. And somehow or another, my sister, stupid girl, was doing this as she was walking, and of course her pennies fly out. And we lived in Ridgecrest, California. You know what the dirt is in Ridgecrest, California? It just sucks up pennies and coins, and you never see them again. I was devastated because those 2 pennies were gone. Well, I shouldn't have been devastated by it. I was just young and stupid. But we learn. We learn that things are not permanent, aren't we? And yet we hold on to them. So, my car. You broke my car. No, it doesn't matter. It's going to wear out anyway, isn't it? That's the way it goes. It says, give him your cloak also. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go what? 2 miles. Why? Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Don't refuse. This is not something that you own in such a way that you can't use it. This is something we should be doing differently than that. So you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? We've got a situation going on right now where we've got a people that we think we should hate. Doesn't apply to the ISIS people, right? This doesn't apply to ISIS. God, you cannot mean I've got to love my enemies. Not really. Well, yeah, really. Leviticus 19, verse 18, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Now, a lot of the Jews had taken that and had created this impetus that said, he didn't say that we're to love our enemies, just that we're supposed to love our neighbor. So, we can hate our enemy. Makes sense to me. How about you? Is that what God intended when he said this? That's not what he intended. He's not talking about the enemies here, is he? That's not the subject here. But nevertheless, we do so. He says, however, I say unto you, what do I say unto you? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Boy, that's hard, isn't it? They're hurting me. Their intent is to hurt me. Their intent is to hurt my family. Their intent is to kill me, perhaps, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Oh, my goodness. He's put it on a different level now, hasn't he? Aren't we supposed to be sons of God? We are, aren't we? We're not if we don't do this right. We don't love our enemies. We don't pray for those who persecute us. We're not sons of God. We can imply that, can't we? Absolutely. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and the rain to rain on the just and the unjust. That would be enough by itself, wouldn't it? I would think so. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. My goodness, that puts it in a nice level. Mom told me to be nice. Even to the ones who are not nice to me? Yes. God tells us to be nice. Even to the ones who are not nice to us? Yes. It's very basic, isn't it? Romans 12, verse 18. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be peaceful with everyone. As much as it depends on you, be at peace with everyone. Verse 19. Never avenge yourselves. Leave it to the wrath of God. You mean I can't do it? My mom, I think I mentioned this once before. She said, I know God says vengeance is mine, but I'm afraid they'll repent before they die. Yeah, she didn't quite have it right sometimes, but she was funny. It is written, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. I will repay. It's not up to us to repay someone, is it? It's up to God to do that. We need to leave it to Him. And to the contrary, in verse 20, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. What does burning coals mean? Literally? No. Conscience, isn't it? We're reaching into his mind and affecting his conscience. By being nice to him instead of evil back to him, we're taking away his justification for being evil to us, and in fact, giving him a reason why he should not be evil to us. We're heaping burning coals on his head. It's beautiful, isn't it? If you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Even the tax collectors do that. Tax collectors is pretty low on the totem pole for these guys, isn't it? Yeah. He says, and if you greet your brothers only, what more are you doing than the others? Even the Gentiles do that. It's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Uh-oh. Got some foreign language in there, except it's not really all that foreign. It's New Testament Greek. Can you read that? It's all right, I can't either. I can put it up there, though. See that last word, teleoi? You've heard that one before. We've mentioned it several times. Ye shall be therefore perfect. You shall be teleoi. It means perfect. Well, sort of. What it means is mature, full grown, finished, complete at the end of a process. We're supposed to grow up, aren't we? One of the things we expect out of a kindergartner is to strike back every once in a while, isn't it? We don't expect an adult to do that, do we? One of the things we expect is for a child to maybe lie occasionally, isn't it? We don't expect an adult to do that, do we? We expect someone who's immature to not handle their sexuality properly. We don't expect an adult to do that, do we? We expect people to live as adult people, as mature, perfect, complete, grown up, if you will. You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. That's the actual concluding remark of this section that he goes through. All right, let's go through it then. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not divorce your wife with just a certificate of divorce. Do not swear falsely. No, not eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. No, I say unto you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery in his heart. Everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery and makes the one who marries her commit adultery as well. Do not take an oath at all. Do not resist the one who is evil. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, is any of this really all that hard? Yeah, a couple of them are, aren't they? But they're really not all that hard if we do it the way God said. You therefore must be perfect as your Father is perfect. If we do that, we're going to be okay, aren't we? But I say unto you, is what Jesus says. Shouldn't we listen to what he says?